Now, as I mentioned in the intro, there was a short story translation that won the Australian Society of Interpreters New Translator Prize. Can you tell us about that?
So that particular piece, and like when we're at university doing translation masters and things, they do encourage us to enter all of these competitions just to develop get experience and B, develop a reputation. It was a really unusual piece about the kinds of things people put on their toast in different areas of Japan. And this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the red bean paste they have. It's quite sweet. Not sort of sweet like sweet's not quite the right word, but it's the closest we're going to get. And in the Nagoya region of Japan, they put it on their toast of a morning. And it was a short story about this person traveling further and further out of the city of Nagoya to find the last possible cafe where this stopped happening. So it's quite a regional thing. And it was just this jaunty little travel log of them going here, there, and everywhere, ordering this particular kind of toast combination and trying to find where it dried up. For those people interested, it ended up drying up at the very edge of Gifu Prefecture next door. But just, I think the jauntiness suited my own slightly humorous style of writing. Um, as I've alluded to, I'm quite serious with world building, and that's, I think, what brings all of the genres I write in together is historical fiction. You've got to be really strong on your world build, and that's based on research. But fantasy and sci-fi as well, it's not just a case of you can throw it all out of your head and it's going to work. Sci-fi, you've still got to have a fair amount of science backing it up to an extent. And same with fantasy, you've really got to take some basic historical period and then add the magic and the fantasy elements into it, and then make all of that, figure out what rules you're going to keep, what rules you're going to break, and then you've got to stick to your rules. You can't go
Mm. Yeah.
breaking your rules, and you've got to be really, really careful not to paint yourself into a corner. I'm not sure if you guys have read the Aragon series. Um,
Might have done. It's a long
no,
time ago. There wasn't
yeah,
one movie based on that, was there?
yeah, there was one movie. It is actually a full
Mm.
book series, but
Mm.
he basically it started out really well, but the way he did his magic system, I think, painted him into a bit of a corner. And it's sort of the last few books got a bit convoluted because of it. So if you're doing world building in any of those, it's something you've got to be a bit careful of. But getting back to the toast, one thing that was just the work, and everyone entering that year had to translate it. But one thing I loved about it was the detail it had of the cafes in Japan, which I'm familiar with because I like writing in them, but the funny little quirks of the cafe and the world building around that, and how they'd set up this idea of regional spreads for toast and all of those things, I geeked out a little bit. So I felt quite close to the work when I was translating it.
So,
So a competition for translation is basically everybody translates the same piece,
Correct.
and
We all And then the judges pick whichever one they think is the best translation of the
right,
piece.
yeah.
So I have no idea how many people entered that year. I think it was quite a large number. I found out later that one of the distant friend of mine was actually on the judging panel, not that he knew I had entered. And yeah, when I mentioned it, it's like, oh, that was your piece. Actually, we had a good number of entries this year, so you did pretty well to win it.
and
Um,
where do the entries come from? Was it any
um,
international competition or?
No, the Orsett Prize is only in Australia, I believe. I think people in New Zealand can also enter.
Ah.
There's a reciprocal arrangement between us and New Zealand for most things. So, but there's still quite a number of new Japanese translators come through every year, and you don't have to be a professional translator to enter. It is open to anybody. So there's a lot of people who just use Japanese in their profession or they're interested who enter as well.
And when they're judging that, are they judging technical accuracy or your interpretation or a bit of both?
Um, Oh, not having ever been on the judging panel for it, I'm not 100% sure, but I think a lot of it is technical accuracy. You've got to um, because as we were mentioning, talking about Japanese earlier, there's some sections where the words don't line up. There is just no equivalent. So it's knowing what to cut, how to keep the maximum amount of information preserved, but also how do you preserve the writer's style?
Mm.
And in this case, I got lucky because I think that writer's style is close to my own style of writing. If it had been a style closer to something like Lord of the Rings, I would have struggled a lot more because my own writing is not very similar to Tolkien. So there is that. It's not just have you got all the words right, it is how well have you preserved the overall message and how well have you preserved the author's style, I
Yeah.
think are some of the big criteria for translation.
Yeah.
As AI is starting to, have a increasing
Yeah,
presence, how is AI factoring into translation with,
it's a
it,
big topic in the industry. Both for, just to clarify for your listeners, interpreting is when someone is doing words, spoken words, and translation is text to text. But in both areas of the industry, it's become quite a hot button issue right now. A lot more translators are using AI tools to help them along. And there is constantly this group of usually IT professionals saying AI is going to wipe out the translation and interpreting industry, but it's not looking like that's going to happen either. It's a bit like how to put it. It's getting rid of a lot of the low-level translation jobs. So things which are very consistent and repetitive, like manuals. Like say your manual for a Toyota or something like that, it doesn't change that much between editions. So an AI can basically do that with a relatively high degree of accuracy, and they can just get a human to proofread it, and it should be okay. Where we're finding that AI is not suitable in any way is anything that's confidential, because if you use an AI, it will inevitably store the data and then use that as training data. So you have to be,
Yeah.
particularly if you're translating documents under a non-disclosure agreement, you cannot use AI for it at all. It's just way too risky.
Yeah.
Legal documents, it's too risky to use AI because AI is not particularly accurate.
Mm.
And engineering, anything where people's lives are on the line, you should never be using AI translation. It's just the risks of it making a mess up are just far too high. And like humans do make mess ups. No translator is perfect. Or if there is a perfect translator out there, I'd love to meet them. But we statistically know the topic better and we're working and we're much better at making informed decisions than the AI is. So we're less likely to make a critical flaw than the AI is as well.
I, I,
Interpreting as well, we're finding much the same thing is it's our humanity is what sets a lot of interpreters apart. If you're walking through Tokyo and you want to order a bowl of noodles, great, use your phone AI. It'll do a great job. Um, if you want someone to come in and interpret the nuts and bolts of a medical diagnosis for prostate cancer, you probably don't want to leave that up to a machine. You probably would like someone who can try and convey things a little bit more softly of, well, we're like you're going to have this treatment. It's not going to hurt. They're just going to put a needle in you and inject you with this radioactive fluid. Sounds a lot better than they're going to shove a needle in you and you're going to be pumped full of radiation.
yeah.
So, and that's really the difference is when you need humanity, you really need a live interpreter. And conferences as well, they're finding that the interpreters are just producing a better quality still than the AIs have been able to produce.
I think the fact that, as you mentioned with your short story that you translated in the competition, it's that understanding of a style of an author and what they're
Mm.
trying to portray with the way that they're doing it is going to take a lot longer for AI to be able to do that, because that's,
Yeah,
that's the humanity in it, is understanding that sort of aspect of it rather than just translating.
and that's it. In all honesty, I do not believe that they will ever crack literature translation. I think it takes a human to understand the nuance and the emotion and how to render that into not just another language but another culture.
Mm.
And that's the real trick, is you're not just bridging apples to apples. Sometimes you've got to figure out the cultural side of it as well, and what nuance is going to work in the same way that the author intended.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, there are people who are quite worried. I'm not one of them, but it certainly is a bit irritating every now and then when people say, "Oh, we'll just get an AI to do it." And
Mm.
you have to wait for the bus to fall off the cliff before they come back and say, "Actually, that didn't go very well." So yeah, I told you
Yeah.
so.
And I suppose there's correlation to writing generally about, there's a lot of concerns around AI being used in writing novels, and could that eventually replace, authors? But my feeling is that, as you said, David, it's the humanity in the writing.
Mm.
Um, I just don't believe that AI will ever be able to replace a human's mind to devise plots and characters and interactions and relationships and subplots and all those things that our human brain can process and combine that with emotions and all that sort of stuff. I think the fears are, there's some foundation for those fears, but I don't believe that the humanity can ever be replaced. Maybe, who knows, maybe 20 years down the track, or even 10 years, we'll be having a different conversation. But at the moment, I'd hate to think that the human mind is going to be replaced by AI for writing stories.
So certainly
Well,
at the moment, I think it's the complexity is or the technology is not there. But it just reminds me a lot of the time when desktop publishing first came out, and the sort of general idea was that publishers are going to be out of a job, and and graphic designers are going to be out of a job because everyone can do it. And then you saw the crap that was produced, and
mm.
everyone went, actually, you probably need somebody who's creative to do that. Just giving somebody a tool doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to produce something out of it at the end of the day.
One of the higher end UN interpreters, and those guys are insanely good at their jobs. What he said was, AI will never replace us, but it will provide tools that will assist us.
Mm. Yeah.
And sometimes it's a case of the AI can pick out the vocab for you. Like, if not everyone keeps a word for calcification in multiple languages in their head all of the time. So if a screen's providing you with vocab as someone speaking, that makes your job easier because you can just string it together. So I
Mm.
can see tools like that becoming very prominent in the industry, but as of the moment, the full-on interpreting AI software's really not there yet. And I'm not seeing like it's going to be in the next 15, 20 years at the speed it's going.
And Harry and I were both at a writers' conference a few weeks ago, and this topic of AI was being discussed on a panel. And one of the authors spoke. He said, "Well, look, for those people who are so anti-AI, anyone that's using Google, using preemptive text on your
Hmm.
mobile phone, using a Word document which does spell correcting,
Hmm.
programs such as Pro Writing Aid, it's been in our lives already for a long time, already starting to rely on
Yeah.
it. So, it's about, as we talked about, just accepting that it is a tool, it's here to stay, and
Hmm.
it's about making sure that it doesn't replace the human mind, and we can use it
Hmm.
as a tool.
And I mean, it's a bit like the sewing machine. Um, if I'm sewing most things, yeah, I'll use a sewing machine, but there's still delicate little jobs where I'll get out a needle and thread and I'll sew by hand because there are circumstances where that's better. So I
Mm,
think it's
mm.
just going to be a time-saving aid, but it's never going to completely replace the old-fashioned ways either.
Let's hope.
Well, Angus here has a lot of tentacles to cross in our favor, so I think
I've noticed
Good
Angus
point.
has been pretty quiet on the subject. He hasn't had a lot to say.
Yeah,
He's a
unfortunately,
man of few words.
the fact that he has to sit on top of his mouth means he doesn't talk an awful lot.
It's a very good point.
Can we now segue into another topic? We've spoken about this prior to coming on air about your thoughts, David, around creating characters when we're talking about
Um,
creative writing or fiction writing generally. And
yeah.
as I said, I did a bit of snooping, and you have written up an eight part blog series where you look at the different elements of creating characters. So can we work our way through those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it comes down to these are just how I create characters. There's no right or wrong way, I think. But yeah, so usually I do start by let me just bring it up so I'm getting it in the same order as you guys have got it. That might make this easier. Okay, so it's the first trick is to give them a visibility. And like if I describe you as say Harry, that doesn't give us a lot
No.
as far as a book's concerned. But if I say Harry with his headphones around his neck, you now get a better image of what Harry is like. You learn a lot about Harry because of the headphones, and I can now put Harry throughout my book in lots of different ways without actually having to mention his name.
Mm.
I can just say, "Oh, a man with the headphones around his neck in the distance," and your brain's going to go instantly to
That's
Harry's
Harry.
there.
Yeah.
You now no longer at the beginning chunk of a new chapter need to say, "And the people in the room were."
Mm.
You can now use these quirks. Maybe it's a lady with a feather in her hat. Maybe this character always wears a particularly obnoxious shade of lilac. It's those little things which, to me, that's where I begin with the character is what visual trait defines them. And I mean, in fantasy, it's dead easy. I make them any number of bizarre creatures, or maybe they've got a tentacle sticking out of their head or something. That makes them really easy to identify. Uh, if you are like when I write historical fiction, actually the main character in my historical fiction is blind, so I now have no visual cues, and everyone's visual cues are now transposed into being a scent, or do they have a particular sound pattern when they're walking? Have they got a limp or something like that? Is how he identifies all of the other characters in the book and how the book's portrayed. So those little quirks, I think, is probably the first step to any character is how are you going to connect them in the reader's mind to be memorable from a visual or other form of standpoint.
Yeah.
And that's something I think we've spoken about this before in other podcasts in terms of descriptions of characters
Mm,
generally. One that comes to mind, describing a little girl who's got red hair and freckles. And so
mm,
instead of having to do a head to foot description of her, just by
mm,
simply mentioning her red hair and freckles, straight away the reader already visualizes. And some characters might only be described by that one particular endearing
mm,
feature. And then you're kind of allowing your readers to sort of fill the blanks as well. Is that kind of what,
mm.
what you're sort of talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. You don't necessarily need a lot. You just need something. There's nothing worse than just having a name. Um, you need a little bit more to grasp onto than that. And as you said, red hair, freckles,
Yeah.
uh, a lilac shirt, obnoxious hat, anything like that, I find works perfectly. And that's one of the I mean, particularly if you guys are writing crime, I think for you guys that's really important because you can then have that cue just in a crowd to let the reader know when they look back at the end for all of the little breadcrumbs along the way. Oh,
Mm,
There
there's
they
the
were.
red-haired girl in the crowd.
Mm.
yep.
Um, Someone spotted someone with freckles but didn't get the other half. You can use all of those things, and that's applicable to any genre, I think.
Mm.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, I think the next one you're going to talk about is the point around nobody's perfect. Is that about character flaws?
Yeah, you've got to have a flaw. There is no character worse than a character that is flawless. They've got no progression at all. And it's not enough to make their circumstances around them bad, because circumstances can change without the character having to do much. They've actually, to be an interesting character, they've got to change over the course of your novel or your series. And none of us are perfect. Everybody's got their flaw. So it's very hard for us to relate to perfect people. And you do see it crop up in novels every now and then of this person who's perfect, but due to this circumstance, they can't express X, Y, Z of their perfection. And often I find those characters are a bit dull. The ones who they might be a genius, but they've got no social skills. They might be this incredibly good sword fighter, but they can't read. I mean, those sorts of characters I think are far more interesting because they then have to overcome that flaw.
Yeah.
And I think
So,
readers relate to those characters because as we're reading, we know we've got flaws. And if your character, if your main protagonist is this perfect knight in shining armor who's 6 foot, 6 foot tall, muscular build, they can do everything, they become so unbelievable that the readers don't really relate to them. So I think for me, a
yeah.
lot of it is the relatability between reader and character.
Mm.
Yeah.
And like I call it the fantasy believability paradox of the more you can be as fantastical as you like, but you have to ground that fantasy in reality. And obviously, I write fantasy, so that's particularly prominent. But in any sort of novel, as you guys would know, writing crime, of you can't really have police driving down the Riverside Expressway shooting pistols out of the side of their car at 6 p.m. in Brisbane. No one's going to believe that because the Riverside Expressway is a car park at 6 p.m. every night. So there's your believability shot right there. So it is keeping that believability in any given story
Yeah.
has to exist. And yeah, that means the characters need to be flawed.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also a good way of creating havoc in your novel as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And we often talk about, the characters' ghosts. What are they? What are they hiding? Their past, um, the fact that they're conflicted. All these things make so much stronger characters. And again, that your readers are going to empathize with those characters because of those flaws.
And I think it's important when you're creating the flaw to understand how the character has gotten that flaw. Like, have they developed a mistrustful nature because they've been betrayed in the past?
Yes. Yes.
Do they insist on doing everything themselves because something's happened when they've asked for help in the past and it's gone really badly? So I actually watch a lot of psychology videos on YouTube and I find them really helpful for character creation of,
Mm,
oh, I'll
mm.
create one with that flaw and that reasoning for that flaw. This is great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
YouTube psychology shorts are great fun for character creation.
Yeah. Yeah. Great for profiling serial killers as well.
Well, I didn't like to mention that one, but if you ever want to be certain about who your local serial killer is, they're useful for that too.
Let's move on to the next point about a placeholder name. How does that play into things?
I usually give mine I don't necessarily keep the name I give the characters initially. And I
Mhm.
find this is sometimes an ongoing process of like, I don't usually base characters off people that I've met, but every now and then you meet someone who is just too extreme a person not to make a character out of them. And so often when I'm writing the novel, I will keep that person's name because it keeps that image in my head. And then for discretionary purposes, that name then gets changed at the end. But
Yeah. You have
sometimes
to
it
be
might
careful
be,
with that.
yeah. Admittedly, again, the joy of writing fantasy is I take an extreme personality and then I just make it 100-fold more extreme. So by the end of it, they look nothing like the original person I got the idea of. But yes, must change the name if you've ever based it off a person.
I can relate to that. I
Thank
was
you, find
thinking,
and replace.
I've just finished writing a crime manuscript, and I'm thinking already ideas for book 2 in the series. And I've got this. There's a guy I know. I won't give too many details, but there's a guy I know, ex-military, and all his traits are who I want in this new character that I'm gonna devise. He's going to be a bit of an anti-hero, but I can't think of a name. I'm just going to refer to him by his real name to start with, because that will enable me to continue to link that character to who I kind of visualize as who this fictional character is going to be. He's going to have a lot of his traits. And then later on, I'll have to, of course, find a more suitable fictional name.
And that's it. And
the only caveat to doing that is that whole global search and replace, when you come up with the name you want, just make sure you haven't made any plays on that person's name. That happened to me. I had a character and changed the name, and there was some comment that was just a play on the person's name, and one of the beta readers just said, "Don't get that." And then I looked at it and gone, "Oh crap, it's because his name's changed." And so you've got to be very careful if you do intend to at the end change the name. Don't do anything that's going to relate to the original name.
Yeah. But I often find there'll sometimes be a name that just speaks to that particular character I want. Like maybe it's Amelia, but I might have a half dozen characters whose names all start with A, which is just not going to work. So I'll keep Amelia for my image in my head, and then later on I'll go through and okay, Amelia can now be Tabitha or Jane or whatever. But I find having that at the beginning, having that name that speaks to that character is really important for not getting writer's block. And then, at the end, one of the final steps to me is changing the name to whatever it needs to be. And on a personal gripe every now and then I do structural editing for other people, and I had one come across my desk a year or two ago, and they had named their main character as an adjective. Never name your character as an adjective, no matter how cutting edge you feel. I could not even get past 5 pages because my eye just stopped at an adjective. So no matter how much you feel you need to be cutting edge, don't use adjectives as nouns.
I did it. I listened to a book recently, and I don't want to. I'm not going to bring up the whole issue of different pronouns. Just to say that it was really confusing because the character was using they, them. But when you were listening to an audiobook, there was several times that they left or they did this. And I was thinking, who else was there? And it was really confusing in an audiobook to have that change in the pronouns. But anyway, we won't go there.
Yeah. I will just add, I think there needs to be, for people wanting to use those pronouns, authors, I think, need to be really careful with how that's marked to prevent issues like that occurring.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something some academic somewhere needs to think of a good solution for, is how to make it more obvious when you don't have the visual cue.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, I won't bang on the point, but I'm actually reading a book right now where there has been a use of a non-binary sort of term for a character, and this character is a very secondary character who has a name. I won't say because it might identify the author, but it has a name that could either be a male or female, and just inexplicably, and to me it feels a bit tokenistic, that this character and only this character, for no apparent reason, is referred to as they, them. And for me, everyone else is he or she, and then for some reason the author has decided that for this particular character, who doesn't play a very important role in the story at all, is going to be referred to as they, them. And I just kind of don't understand why. It almost to me just feels like it's a token thing to do to appease readers. I don't know. But anyway, look, probably a different conversation for a different day, but I just thought I'd jump on that, the fact that we've sort of raised that.
Yeah, I think that might be one for people a lot more qualified in that field than I to discuss.
Yeah.
Let's all tread carefully. Move on.
Yes. Let's move on to the next point in terms of character.
The octopus is starting to tiptoe away. Yeah.